When Captain America Civil War came around, the MCU had been going on for like 8 years, and though seeing the Marvel Universe come to life on screen was frickin' awesome, something in the universe had felt a bit off the whole time. Due to various behind-the-scenes licensing bullcrap, the MCU had been built without some of Marvel's most iconic characters, like the X-Men, the Fantastic Four, and its most popular character of all, Spider-Man. Having a Marvel Universe without your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, and it just felt wrong no matter how good the rest of the characters in movies were. So when we learned Spidey was going to finally be let out of his cage over at Sony to come join the MCU, it was very damn exciting. And in Civil War, when Spider-Man finally jumped onto the screen with Iron Man and Captain America in all his glory, was such an awesome moment because it was something we thought we'd never get to see. But sadly, soon after, many of us came to realize that the character we were watching was not actually Spider-Man. Sure, he may be named Peter Parker, shoot webs, fight crime, and wear a Spider-Man costume, but those things actually aren't what makes Spider-Man Spider-Man. Well, then what does, eh? I mean, every version of the character's gonna be different. Sure, the costume's changed up a bit. His Aunt May's hotter. He's more socially respected at school than a traditional Peter Parker. But should those things really matter? Is that superficial crap like that enough to justify saying this character ain't Spider-Man? Well, no. No, it's actually not. There's plenty of versions of the character who are very, very different than his classic portrayal. The Ultimate Comics version, both versions of Peter from Into the Spider-Verse, the Spectacular Spider-Man cartoon version, even the 2 previous film series versions. None of them are one-to-one, or even close in some cases. And lots of people debate all the little details they do differently from the comics. But there's one thing they all share in common, no matter their differences, that makes them all still feel like they're your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. And that's their origin story. MCU Peter was introduced in Civil War without any real backstory. We don't see him get bit by a radioactive spider or an origin to why he wears a costume or fights crime. He gives Tony a vague explanation of why it's the right thing to do. But his origin is not explored at all. And I don't even think that's a problem. I think the intention was likely to save that for his upcoming solo film, since in Civil War he was really just a side character. But when Spider-Man Homecoming came out, we got nothing. We don't learn a thing about this guy or why he does what he does. We're just left to fill in the blanks about his backstory with what we know about previous Spider-Man's origin stories. We all assumed the iconic bit by a spider, doesn't stop a criminal, Uncle Ben dies, great power and responsibility, and boom, Spider-Man. But these are all just assumptions we made. And the more we watched, the more those assumptions seem to be wrong. Yes, Spider-Man's had an iconic origin story since he was created that's been done time and again in many, many adaptations of the character. But none of those previous versions are actually canon with this new version. And any assumptions we made about this version's origin were nothing but total assumptions. This version of Peter acts completely contrary to what most people would expect him to. He's reckless, impulsive, childish, and the lessons of power and responsibility are clearly not at the forefront of his mind most of the time. All things that would work fine for a new teen hero trying to find his way in the world, but not for frickin' Spider-Man. They specifically chose not to do an origin story for this version of the character, not even a teeny flashback, because they felt like audiences had already seen it multiple times and knew it already. But apparently the writers hadn't, because they didn't seem to take this element of the character into account at all when writing him. In the first movie, most of what he does is driven by his desire to prove himself ready to be a full Avenger to Tony Stark, causing him to make reckless decisions that endanger others, like leaving unknown weapons technology with Ned. In the second movie, he abdicates responsibility to others many times, refusing to help S.H.I.E.L.D. and handing the technology he inherited from Tony Stark over to Mysterio. He stands up and fixes his mistakes in both movies, but if the writers were taking into account that he'd tragically learned the classic lesson of power and responsibility from his Uncle Ben, Spider-Man would have reacted to everything in these movies totally different, and the plots would have had to been totally different as well to account for that. They left his backstory unspoken to just let us fill in the blanks with what we already knew about the character. But then they wrote him in a way completely contrary to everything we know about the guy. As we watch these movies, we're forced to realize that we don't actually know this dude at all. And though there's glimmers of Spider-Man in there, it's a version very different than what most people would have asked for. In the MCU version, we didn't ever learn what being Spider-Man specifically means compared to being one of the 50 other random superheroes out there. And in a universe with so many other superheroes, I think it's more important than ever to say what sets this one apart from all of them. Spider-Man is a fun character, but he also holds a sadness within him. No matter what he does, he's always holding the regret of what happened to his Uncle Ben in the back of his mind, and that makes him incredibly interesting. He can save the entire world many, many times, and yet he will always feel driven to keep helping people whenever and wherever he can, no matter the cost to himself. Without this core element to the character, this is not Spider-Man. This is just another in a long line of random-ass superheroes with cool powers and a cool costume. And though we were likely meant to assume that his origin was what it's always been, because they never set it in stone like other MCU heroes, the writers took the character off in a direction that a lot of people did not recognize as being the Spider-Man they'd hoped to see in the MCU way back when he first appeared in Civil War. But here's the really interesting thing. It's not like it's just me saying this, or just a bunch of disgruntled nerds out there. The literal MCU agrees with us. That's why they needed to turn the third movie into one long-ass origin story where Peter's impulsive, selfish actions led to Aunt May being killed, and he needed two other beloved Spider-Men to come in and help teach him what being Spider-Man even means. Since they never bothered to put Uncle Ben in the role, they gave the power and responsibility line to Aunt May since we'd seen her as a strong presence in this version of Peter's life. And like Ben, she died due to the chain reaction caused by Peter trying to use the power at his disposal, in this case Doctor Strange's magic, for selfish gain, without the thought of consequences for others. Then two previous versions of Spidey had to come in to mentor him about what a Spider-Man should act like in this kind of situation by talking about their own tragedies with Uncle Ben and Gwen Stacy. And at the very end of the movie, for the first time in the entire trilogy, the character finally started to feel like Spider-Man. Not because he's wearing his classic style suit or because he's now a loner whose life isn't going well like he's usually portrayed in the comics, but because he sacrificed his friendship with Ned and his romance with MJ in order to keep them safe. He's finally learned that with great power there must also come great responsibility, even though he must sacrifice the things he holds the most dear in this world to live up to that lesson. Had the events of this movie not happened to him, had his aunt not died, I think he would have done everything in his power to become close with Ned and MJ again at the end, because across all three movies, this was one of his main drives. Whether for Stark, MJ, or Ned, his main desire in all three movies was really just a connection with others. And that's exactly what he gives up, a connection with anyone in the world. Whatever they choose to do next with the character in future movies, even if they want to undo all of this and have him and MJ get back together, the writers will be forced to consider Peter's new origin story here and how it would influence the character of Spider-Man going forwards. Even if they do a crappy-ass job of it, they'll need to take this origin into account when writing him, just like the previous writers would have had to do if they'd given Peter an origin at the beginning of the franchise. I understand why they didn't want to spend half of the runtime of Homecoming doing his backstory again, but they didn't have to. All of this could have been avoided with one little flashback like they did in Spider-Verse. We see him get bit, he does something selfish, and Ben gets shot, and Peter remembers those iconic words. Or just one little scene where he tells Ned about his Uncle Ben or walks past his grave. Boom! The writers would have had to take this element of the character into account, and his origin would be what drives the character forwards instead of whatever plot is going on around him at the moment. And again, I think they originally intended Ben to be in his backstory, but they never explicitly said it, and now, the more we watch, the more it seems like this guy may not have even had an Uncle Ben, which is a real shame. So yeah, there's a million differences with this version of Peter, whether it's how his villains are portrayed or his school life. But there were a million differences with the Raimi and Amazing Spider-Man versions of Peter as well, and those are more or less accepted. Everyone's got their preferences on how the character should be portrayed and what era should be the inspirations for the character. And I'm gonna be honest, I'm actually not a hater of this version of the character, especially in Avengers and Civil War. I have my opinions, but I think the actor's fine, and I actually like a lot of the moments and elements in these movies. But he never really felt like Spider-Man, except for a couple moments, and I think that's a shame, because Spider-Man is such a strong and awesome presence in the Marvel Universe. And I do hope, now that they've finally tried to fix everything they've done wrong with the character, that the next time we see him, he'll be more akin to what we all know and love about the guy as he stands, I don't know, side by side with Wolverine, or whatever badass stuff they've got planned for the next Avengers movie. But if that shitty looking show on Disney Plus is any indication, I highly doubt it. And there you go. I think that's enough about Spider-Man for one day. But I got a million more commentaries in me about other characters who've been done well or absolutely garbagely, just aching to burst out. If you want to be one of the poor souls on the receiving ends of such a rant, click that good old subscribe and bell button and I'll start yelling at you about, I don't know, something in your feed at some totally unexpected time in the future. But now that we're here, what the hell do you think? Do you agree that it's a complete another lack of his origin story that makes this character feel and act so different than Spidey usually does in other adaptations? Or do you think this was the most spidery Spider-Man who ever Spider-Man and I should just shit my goddamn trap? Any other characters you think suffered from a lack of a proper origin story? I know I got a few others in mind I feel that way about, and I may make a video about them in the future, but let me know below. And until next time, always remember to hyphenate your Spider-Man, kids. Adios.